Driven to Win presents The Moon of Skulls by Robert E. Howard. Chapter 2. The People of the Stalking Death.
Their gods were sadder than the sea, gods of wandering will, who cried for blood like beasts at night, sadly from hill to hill. Chesterton. As Kane fell, he followed his fighting instinct, twisting in mid-air so that when he struck, were it 10 or 1,000 feet below, he would land on top of the man who fell with him. The end came suddenly, much more suddenly than the Englishman had thought for. He lay half-stunned for an instant, then looking up, saw dimly the narrow bridge banding the sky above him and the forms of the warriors, limned in the moonlight, and grotesquely foreshortened as they leaned over the edge. He lay still, knowing that the beams of the moon did not pierce the deeps in which he was hidden, and that to those watchers he was invisible. Then, when they vanished from view, he began to review his present plight. The black man was dead, and only for the fact that his corpse had cushioned the fall, Kane would have been dead likewise, for they had fallen a considerable distance. As it was, the Englishman was stiff and bruised. He drew his sword from the native's body, thankful that it had not been broken, and began to grope about in the darkness. His hand encountered the edge of what seemed a cliff. He had thought that he was on the bottom of the chasm and that its impression of great depth had been a delusion, but now he decided that he had fallen on a ledge part of the way down. He dropped a small stone over the side, and after what seemed a very long time, he heard the faint sound of it striking far below.
Somewhat at a loss as to how to proceed, he drew flint and steel from his belt and struck them to some tinder, warily shielding the light with his hands. The faint illumination showed a large ledge jutting out from the side of the cliff, that is, the side next to the hills to which he had been attempting to cross. He had fallen close to the edge, and it was only by the narrowest margin that he had escaped sliding off it, not knowing his position. Crouching there, his eyes seeking to accustom themselves to the abysmal gloom, he made out what seemed to be a darker shadow in the shadows of the wall. On closer examination, he found it to be an opening large enough to admit his body standing erect. A cavern, he assumed, and though its appearance was dark and forbidding in the extreme, he entered, groping his way when the tinder burned out. Where it led to, he naturally had no idea, but any action was preferable to sitting still until the mountain vultures plucked his bones. For a long way, the cave floor tilted upward, solid rock beneath his feet, and Kane made his way with some difficulty up the rather steep slant, slipping and sliding now and then. The cavern seemed a large one, for at no time after entering it could he touch the roof, nor could he, with a hand on one wall, reach the other. At last the floor became level, and Kane sensed that the cavern was much larger there. The air seemed better, though the darkness was just as impenetrable. Suddenly he stopped dead in his tracks. From somewhere in front of him there came a strange, indescribable rustling. Without warning, something smote him in the face and slashed wildly. All about him sounded the eerie murmurings of many small wings, and suddenly Kane smiled crookedly, amused, relieved, and chagrined. Bats, of course. The cavern was swarming with them. Still, it was a shaky experience, and as he went on and the wings whispered through the vast emptiness of the great cavern, Kane's mind found space to dally with a bizarre thought. Had he wandered into hell by some strange means? And were these in truth bats? Or were they lost souls winging through everlasting night?
Then, thought Solomon Kane, I will soon confront Satan himself. And even as he thought this, his nostrils were assailed by a horrid scent, fetid and repellent.
The scent grew as he went slowly on, and Kane swore softly, though he was not a profane man. He sensed that the smell betokened some hidden threat, some unseen malevolence, inhuman and deathly, and his somber mind sprang at supernatural conclusions. However, he felt perfect confidence in his ability to cope with any fiend or demon, armored as he was in unshakable faith of creed and the knowledge of the rightness of his cause. What followed happened suddenly. He was groping his way along when in front of him, two narrow yellow eyes leapt up in the darkness, eyes that were cold and expressionless, too hideously close-set for human eyes, and too high for any four-legged beast. What horror had thus reared itself up in front of him? "This is Satan," thought Kane, as the eyes swayed above him. And the next instant he was battling for his life with the darkness that seemed to have taken tangible form and thrown itself about his body and limbs in great slimy coils. Those coils lapped his sword arm and rendered it useless. With the other hand he groped for dagger or pistol, flesh crawling as his fingers slipped from slick scales, while the hissing of the monster filled the cavern with a cold paean of terror. There in the black dark, to the accompaniment of the bat's leathery rustlings, Kane thought like a rat in the grip of a mouse snake, and he could feel his ribs giving and his breath going before his frantic left hand closed on his dagger hilt. Then, with a volcanic twist and wrench of his steel-thewed body, he tore his left arm partly free and plunged the keen blade again and again to the hilt in the sinuous, writhing terror that enveloped him, feeling at last the quivering coils loosen and slide from his limbs to lie about his feet like huge cables. The mighty serpent lashed wildly in its death struggles, and Kane, avoiding its bone-shattering blows, reeled away in the darkness, laboring for breath. If his antagonist had not been Satan himself, it had been Satan's nearest earthly satellite, thought Solomon, hoping devoutly that he would not be called upon to battle another in the darkness there.
It seemed to him that he had been walking through the blackness for ages, and he began to wonder if there were any end to the cave, when a glimmer of light pierced the darkness. He thought it to be an outer entrance a great way off, and started forward swiftly, but to his astonishment, he brought up short against a blank wall after taking a few strides. Then he perceived that the light came through a narrow crack in the wall, and feeling over this wall, he found it to be of different material from the rest of the cave, consisting, apparently, of regular blocks of stone joined together with mortar of some sort, an indubitably man-built wall. The light streamed between two of these stones where the mortar had crumbled away. Kane ran his hands over the surface with an interest beyond his present needs. The work seemed very old and very much superior to what might be expected of a tribe of ignorant savages. He felt the thrill of the explorer and discoverer. Certainly no white man had ever seen this place and lived to tell of it, for when he had landed on the dank west coast some months before, preparing to plunge into the interior, he had had no hint of such a country as this. The few white men who knew anything at all of Africa with whom he had talked had never even mentioned the land of skulls or the she-fiend who ruled it. Kane thrust against the wall cautiously. The structure seemed weakened from age. A vigorous shove in it gave perceptibly. He hurled himself against it with all his weight, and a whole section of wall gave way with a crash, precipitating him into a dimly lighted corridor amid a heap of stone, dust, and mortar. He sprang up and looked about, expecting the noise to bring a horde of wild spearmen. Utter silence reigned. The corridor in which he now stood was much like a long, narrow cave itself, save that it was the work of man. It was several feet wide, and the roof was many feet above his head. Dust lay ankle-deep on the floor, as if no foot had trod there for countless centuries.
and the dim light, Kane decided, filtered in somehow through the roof or ceiling, for nowhere did he see any doors or windows. At last he decided the source was the ceiling itself, which was of a peculiar phosphorescent quality. He set off down the corridor, feeling uncomfortably like a gray ghost moving along the gray halls of death and decay. The evident antiquity of his surroundings depressed him, making him sense vaguely the fleeting and futile existence of mankind. That he was now on top of the earth he believed, since light of his sort came in, but where, he could not even offer a conjecture. This was a land of enchantment, a land of horror and fearful mysteries, the jungle and river natives had said, and he had gotten whispered hints of its terrors ever since he had set his back to the slave coast and ventured into the hinterlands alone. Now and then he caught a low, indistinct murmur which seemed to come through one of the walls, and he at last came to the conclusion that he had stumbled onto a secret passage in some castle or house. The natives who had dared speak to him of Nagari had whispered of a juju city, built of stone, set high amid the grim black crags of the Fetish Hills. Then, thought Kane, it may be that I have blundered upon the very thing I sought, and am in the midst of that city of terror. He halted, and choosing a place at random, began to loosen the mortar with his dagger. As he worked, he again heard that low murmur, increasing in volume as he bored through the wall, and presently the point pierced through, and looking through the aperture it had made, he saw a strange and fantastic scene. He was looking into a great chamber, whose walls and floors were of stone, and whose mighty roof was upheld by gigantic stone columns, strangely carved. Ranks of feathered black warriors lined the walls, and a double column of them stood like statues before a throne set between two stone dragons which were larger than elephants. These men he recognized by their bearing and general appearance to be tribesmen of the warriors he had fought at the chasm. But his gaze was drawn irresistibly to the great, grotesquely ornamented throne. There, dwarfed by the ponderous splendor about her, a woman reclined. A black woman she was, young and of a tigerish comeliness. She was naked except for a beplumed helmet, armbands, anklets, and a girdle of colored ostrich feathers, and she sprawled upon the silken cushions with her limbs thrown about in voluptuous abandon. Even at that distance, Kane could make out that her features were regal, yet barbaric, haughty and imperious, yet sensual, and with a touch of ruthless cruelty about the curl of full red lips. Kane felt his pulse quicken. This could be no other than she whose crimes had become almost mythical, Nakari of Nagari, demon queen of a demon city, whose monstrous lust for blood had set half a continent shivering. At least she seemed human enough. But tales of the fearful river tribes had lent her a supernatural aspect. Kane had half expected to see a loathsome semi-human monster out of some past and demoniacal age.
The Englishman gazed, fascinated though repelled. Not even in the courts of Europe had he seen such grandeur. The chamber and all its accoutrements, from the carven serpents twined about the bases of the pillars to the dimly seen dragons on the shadowy ceiling, were fashioned on a gigantic scale. The splendor was awesome, elephantine, inhumanly oversized, and almost numbing to the mind which sought to measure and conceive the magnitude thereof. To Kane, it seemed that these things must have been the work of gods rather than men, for this chamber alone would dwarf most of the castles he had known in Europe. The black people who thronged that mighty room seemed grotesquely incongruous. They were not the architects of that ancient place.
As Kane realized this, the sinister importance of Queen Nakari dwindled. Sprawled on that august throne in the midst of the terrific glory of another age, she seemed to assume her true proportions, a spoiled, petulant child engaged in a game of make-believe, and using for her sport a toy discarded by her elders. And at the same time a thought entered Kane's mind. Who were these elders? Still, the child could become deadly in her game, as the Englishman soon saw. A tall, massive black came through the ranks fronting the throne, and after prostrating himself 4 times before it, remained on his knees, evidently waiting permission to speak. The Queen's air of lazy indifference fell from her, and she straightened with a quick life motion that reminded Kane of a leopardess springing erect. She spoke, and the words came faintly to him as he strained his faculties to hear. She spoke in a language very similar to that of the river tribes. "Speak." "Great and terrible one," said the kneeling warrior, and Kane recognized him as the chief who had first accosted him on the plateau, the chief of the guards on the cliffs. "Let not the fire of your fury consume your slave." The young woman's eyes narrowed viciously. "You know why you were summoned, son of a vulture? Fire of beauty, the stranger brought no gifts." "No gifts," she spat out the words. "What have I to do with gifts? I bade you slay all black men who came empty-handed. Did I tell you to slay white men? Gazelle of Nagari, he came climbing the crags in the night like an assassin, with a dagger as long as a man's arm in his hand. The boulder we hurled down missed him, and we met him upon the plateau, and took him to the bridge across the sky, where, as is the custom, we thought to slay him. For this was your word that you were weary of men who came wooing you." "Black men, fool," she snarled. "Black men! Your slave did not know, Queen of Beauty. The strange man fought like a mountain leopard. 2 men he slew, and fell with the last one into the chasm, and so he perished, Star of Nagari." "I," the Queen's tone was venomous, "the first great man who ever came to Nagari, one who might have— Rise, fool." The man got to his feet. "Mighty lioness, might not this one have come seeking?"
The sentence was never completed. Even as he straightened, Nakari made a swift gesture with her hand. 2 warriors plunged from the silent ranks, and 2 spears crossed in the chief's body before he could turn. A gurgling scream burst from his lips, blood spurted high in the air, and the corpse fell flatly at the foot of the great throne. The ranks never wavered, but Kane caught the sidelong flash of strangely red eyes and the involuntary wetting of thick lips. Nakari had half risen as the spears flashed, and now she sank back, an expression of cruel satisfaction on her beautiful face, and a strange brooding gleam in her scintillant eyes. An indifferent wave of her hand, and the corpse was dragged away by the heels, the dead arms trailing limply in the wide smear of blood left by the passage of the body. Kane could see other wide stains crossing the stone floor, some almost indistinct, others less dim. How many wild scenes of blood and cruel frenzy had the great stone throne dragons looked upon with their carven eyes? He did not doubt, now, the tales told him by the river tribes. These people were bred in rapine and horror. Their prowess had burst their brains. They lived like some terrible beast only to destroy. There were strange gleams behind their eyes, which at times lit those eyes with upleaning flames and shadows of hell. What had the river tribes said of these mountain people who had ravaged them for countless centuries? That they were henchmen of death who stalked among them and whom they worshipped. Still, the thought hovered in Kane's mind as he watched. Who built this place?
And why were these people evidently in possession? Fighting men such as they were could not have reached the culture evidenced by these carvings. Yet the river tribes had spoken of no other men than those upon which he now looked. The Englishman tore himself away from the fascination of the barbaric scene with an effort. He had no time to waste. As long as they thought him dead, he had more chance of eluding possible guards and seeking what he had come to find. He turned and set off down the dim corridor. No plan of action offered itself to his mind, and one direction was as good as another. The passage did not run straight. It turned and twisted, following the line of the walls, Kane supposed, and found time to wonder at the evident enormous thickness of those walls. He expected at any moment to meet some guard or slave, but as the corridors continued to stretch empty before him, with the dusty floors unmarked by any footprint, he decided that either the passages were unknown to the people of Nagari, or else, for some reason, were never used.
He kept a close lookout for secret doors, and at last found one, made fast on the inner side with a rusty bolt set in a groove of the wall. This he manipulated cautiously, and presently, with a creaking which seemed terrifically loud in the stillness, the door swung inward. Looking out, he saw no one, and stepping warily through the opening, he drew the door to behind him, noting that it assumed the part of a fantastic picture painted on the wall. He scraped a mark with his dagger at the point where he believed the hidden spring to be on the outer side, for he knew not when he might need to use the passage again. He was in a great hall, through which ran a maze of giant pillars, much like those of the throne chamber. Among them he felt like a child in some great forest, yet they gave him some slight sense of security, since he believed that, gliding among them like a ghost through a jungle, he could elude the black people in spite of their craft. He set off, choosing his direction at random and going carefully. Once he heard a mutter of voices, and leaping upon the base of a column, clung there while two black women passed directly beneath him. But besides these, he encountered no one. It was an uncanny sensation, passing through this vast hall, which seemed empty of human life, but in some other part of which Kane knew there might be throngs of people, hidden from sight by the pillars. At last, after what seemed an eternity of following these monstrous mazes, he came upon a huge wall, which seemed to be either a side of the hall or a partition, and, continuing along this, he saw in front of him a doorway before which two spearmen stood like black statues. Kane, peering about the corner of a column base, made out two windows high in the wall, one on each side of the door, and noting the ornate carvings which covered the walls, determined on a desperate plan. He felt it imperative that he should see what lay within that room. The fact that it was guarded suggested that the room beyond the door was either a treasure chamber or a dungeon, and he felt sure that his ultimate goal would prove to be a dungeon. Kane retreated to a point out of sight of the guards and began to scale the wall, using the deep carvings for hand and footholds. It proved even easier than he had hoped, and, having climbed to a point level with the windows, he crawled cautiously along a horizontal line, feeling like an ant on a wall. The guards far below him never looked up, and finally he reached the nearer window and drew himself up over the sill. He looked down into a large room, empty of life, but equipped in a manner sensuous and barbaric. Silken couches and velvet cushions dotted the floor in profusion, and tapestries heavy with gold work hung upon tile walls. The ceiling, too, was worked in gold.
Strangely incongruous, crude trinkets of ivory and ironwood, unmistakably savage in workmanship, littered the place, symbolic enough of this strange kingdom where signs of barbarism vied with a strange culture. The outer door was shut, and in the wall opposite was another door, also closed. Kane descended from the window, sliding down the edge of a tapestry as a sailor slides down a sail rope, and crossed the room. His feet sunk noiselessly into the deep fabric of the rug which covered the floor, and which, like all the other furnishings, seemed ancient to the point of decay. At the door he hesitated. To step into the next room might be a desperately hazardous thing to do. Should it prove to be filled with black men, his escape was cut off by the spearmen outside the other door. Still, he was used to taking all sorts of wild chances, and now, sword in hand, he flung the door open with such a suddenness intended to numb with surprise for an instant any foe who might be on the other side. Kane took a swift step within, ready for anything, then halted suddenly, struck speechless and motionless for a second. He had come thousands of miles in search of something, and there before him lay the object of his search.
Thank you for listening to today's chapter of The Moon of Skulls by Robert E. Howard. Stay tuned for the next chapter, only on Driven to Win.